She carried the weight of a child on her back and a prayer in her chest. He hadn't spoken to a soul in years, but when she knocked, the silence cracked, and so did his heart. The knock came just before dawn. It was brittle, desperate, 3 quick taps, then silence. Gideon Boone didn't move at first. He sat hunched by the hearth, one boot off, one hand curled around a tin cup that had long gone cold. The fire had burned low during the night, and in its orange glow the cabin looked like a place abandoned. But it was. Gideon was very much alive. Alone, silent, haunted, but alive. Another knock, then a voice. "Please, someone." He stood. The floor creaked under his weight, boards familiar with the slow, stiff drag of a man who hadn't had company in years. Gideon crossed the cabin in a few heavy strides and unlatched the door, unsure why his chest suddenly felt tight. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hope. It was something else, something like recognition but twisted with ache. Outside stood a girl, soaked to the bone, mud caked up her skirt, arms locked tight around something bundled in a blanket. She couldn't have been more than 13. Behind her, the mountain dropped into mist. Trees leaned into the wind like old men whispering secrets. Snow hadn't started, but it was in the air, the kind of air that turns to steel in your lungs. "Are you Gideon Boone?" she asked. He said nothing, just stared. I was told you live here. I'm Ruth," she said quickly, words tumbling out between shivers. "And this is Caleb, my little brother. He's 3. She adjusted the bundle in her arms, and from the folds of fabric emerged a pale, sleepy face. The boy didn't cry. He just looked, wide-eyed, at the bearded man in the doorway. "We got no one left," she whispered. "Mama passed last spring. Pa didn't come back from the trail." Still, Gideon didn't speak. Ruth swallowed hard. Her lips were turning blue. "Please, be our father." The words hit like thunder. Not loud, not sudden, but they cracked something old and buried inside him. Gideon stepped back, opened the door wide without a word, and Ruth stepped in. The cabin swallowed her whole. She was small, smaller than any girl should have had to be, and the boy on her shoulder was limp with sleep and cold. Gideon shut the door against the wind, then turned. "Sit," he said finally, voice rough with disuse. Ruth obeyed. She sank to her knees beside the fire, clutching Caleb tighter. Gideon moved slow but with purpose, grabbing another log, stoking the flame until it spat sparks into the room. He pointed toward a rough-hewn chair. "Put the boy there." She hesitated, then laid Caleb down gently, unwrapping the damp blanket to reveal small hands, dirt-smudged cheeks, and thin legs trembling from chill. Gideon stepped away and returned with a quilt, tucking it around the child without meeting Ruth's eyes. "I can help," Ruth said softly, already standing again. "Chop wood, carry water, I can sew. Mama taught me before she got too weak." Gideon stared at her, not cruelly, not cold, but like a man staring at something he didn't believe could be real. "I don't need help," he said. "But we do." That silenced the room more than anything. Even the fire seemed to hush itself. She didn't cry, not once, but her shoulders curled in just slightly, as though bracing against another door being shut. Gideon turned away, fiddled with a dented kettle, poured hot water into a tin mug. "Drink." Ruth took it with both hands. "Thank you." They said nothing else for a long while. Caleb slept. The fire grew strong. And Gideon watched the girl out of the corner of his eye. Her boots were too big, her hands too raw, her hair clung to her face in wet strands, but her spine stayed straight. She didn't slouch, didn't beg, didn't look for pity. "You walked up the mountain?" he asked at last. She nodded. "From Wren Hollow." Gideon stiffened. That was 3 valleys south. Too far for a girl her size, too far with a child in tow. "Who told you I was here?" "A preacher, at the last outpost. Said you used to be kind. Said you once took in a dog someone tried to drown in the river. Said if anyone would take us, it'd be you." Gideon's jaw tightened. He stared at the fire for a long time. "I'm not that man anymore." "Maybe you don't have to be," Ruth replied gently. "Maybe just tonight, just long enough to keep Caleb warm." He didn't answer, but he stood, moved to the old cupboard and pulled down a pan. "Hungry?" he asked. She nodded, the motion small. There wasn't much. A bit of cornmeal, some dried beans, a heel of bread too tough to chew but soft enough when soaked. He cooked in silence. She watched every move, eyes wide and unblinking, not with fear, with calculation. Ruth Wren was used to being in charge, of figuring things out, of staying alive. When the stew was ready, Gideon placed it in a shallow bowl and handed it to her. "I'll eat later." She didn't protest, just took the bowl and set it carefully on her lap, then lifted a small spoon to Caleb's lips. He stirred, blinked, and took a bite. It was the first time Gideon saw Ruth smile. Later, after Caleb had eaten and fallen back to sleep curled on a pile of folded quilts, Ruth sat on the floor near the fire. "You don't talk much," she said quietly. "No need. Sometimes need don't ask." Gideon almost smiled at that, almost. She looked up. "Do you believe in God?" He didn't answer right away. "I used to." Her voice didn't change. "I still do." And just like that, the silence between them became something different. Not heavy, not distant, just shared. Outside, wind rustled the trees. Snow began to fall, soft as breath. Inside, a girl with too many burdens rocked her brother gently and stared into the fire. And a man with too many ghosts watched her and remembered what it was like to protect something that needed him. The morning came gray, light breaking through the old shutters in muted streaks. The fire had burned low again, and frost crawled along the windows in delicate patterns like spider webs spun by angels. Gideon Boone stirred first. His joints ached as they always did when cold settled deep, but something was different. For the first time in years, the air inside the cabin wasn't hollow. He turned his head slowly. Ruth was still curled by the fire, her arms draped protectively around Caleb, her face slack in sleep. Her boots were off, socks mismatched, the soles threadbare. Caleb, wrapped in quilts, snored softly, one hand fisted against his chest as if afraid someone might take the warmth away. Gideon stood. The floor creaked under his step and the girl's eyes flickered open instantly. She didn't sit up, didn't startle, just watched him, silent and alert. "You sleep?" he asked. "A little," she replied. "Boy, more than me." Gideon nodded. "Oats'll be ready soon." She sat up, gently adjusting Caleb without waking him. "Thank you." The words were small but real, and Gideon wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to a child thanking him like a grown woman. But Ruth Wren was no ordinary child. She looked at the world like it owed her nothing. And that, more than anything, told Gideon she'd earned her bruises the hard way. Outside, snow had thickened overnight. A full inch blanketed the earth and more was coming. Gideon pulled on his coat and stepped onto the porch. Cold air slapped him awake. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved except wind through pines. He worked fast, checked the coop, broke the ice in the water trough, split 2 rounds of kindling. By the time he returned, the cabin smelled of oats and wood smoke. Ruth had stirred the coals back to life and was gently feeding Caleb warm spoonfuls while holding her own bowl in her lap. "You made this?" he asked, surprised. "I watched you last night." He didn't know whether to be impressed or uneasy. "Don't get used to it," he muttered. "I don't get used to much." There it was again, that quiet defiance. Not rebellion, not sass, just truth. Gideon didn't answer. He grabbed a bowl, filled it, and sat by the window. They ate in silence until Caleb said something. "Bird," he mumbled, pointing toward the shutter. Ruth smiled. "You see a bird, baby." "Blue." Gideon stood slowly, peered through the crack in the wood, and sure enough, a blue jay flitted between the trees. "Your brother don't talk much," he said. Ruth shrugged. "He used to talk more, then Mama passed." Gideon didn't ask how. He didn't need to. Death was the only thing that lingered long enough in these parts to be familiar. "He'll come around," Gideon said finally. "You think so?" "If he's got the right soil to grow in." She looked at him then, really looked, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. He held her gaze. "I don't know much about children," he added. "I do." The room went still again, but this time Gideon didn't mind it. Around midday, the sound of hooves startled the cabin. Gideon dropped his bowl and reached for the rifle hanging near the door. "Stay inside," he said. Ruth obeyed instantly, scooping Caleb up and backing into the shadow of the corner. The hooves came slow, deliberate, not panicked, not fast, A lone rider, maybe two. Gideon stepped onto the porch, rifle angled low but ready. A figure emerged from the trees, on foot, not mounted. He walked beside a mule packed with firewood. Tall, gray-bearded, wrapped in a thick duster. He raised a hand in greeting. "Peaceful," the man called. "Just passing through." Gideon did lower the rifle. "Name?" "Amos Briggs, trapper. Been running the ridge for a decade." Gideon narrowed his eyes. "You don't pass through here by accident." Amos gave a lopsided grin. "That true, but storm's pushing south. Figured I'd take the long trail, get ahead of it." Gideon stepped off the porch. "You sick?" "Only sick of jerky and sleeping on rocks." "You can camp by the stream, half a mile north." "Fair deal," Amos said, nodding. "Just came to see if the old man on the mountain was still alive." "Still breathing." Amos looked past him toward the cabin. "You got company." Gideon stiffened. Amos held up both hands. "Ain't my business." Gideon said nothing. Amos turned, led the mule back toward the tree line. But before disappearing, he called out, "You ever need salt or flour, I'll trade straight. Still got that blue tin stove?" "I do." "Then we'll talk again." And then he was gone. Gideon lowered the rifle slowly. Ruth stepped out. "Who was that?" "Just a trapper." "Did he see us?" "Don't think so." She nodded, biting her lip. "You think he'll talk?" "Maybe." Gideon didn't lie to children. Not ever. And Ruth wasn't the kind you coddle. "What happens if he does?" Gideon looked toward the trees, the wind slicing through them like knives. "Depends who's listening." That night Ruth woke screaming. It wasn't a loud scream, just a strangled gasp as her body shot upright. She clawed at the quilt like she couldn't breathe. Gideon was beside her in seconds, one hand on her shoulder, the other on his knife. But there was no threat, just her, trembling. "I'm sorry," she choked. "I didn't mean to, I didn't." "You dreaming?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, tears streamed down her face. "It's all right," he said. But she shook her head. "I dream of the wagon turning over, of Mama screaming, of Caleb crying for her after she was already gone." Gideon sat down slowly beside her. "Dreams don't mean you're weak." "I know," she whispered, "but I hate them." He nodded once. "You ever have dreams?" she asked. "I do." "What of?" He stared at the fire, eyes far away. "Of a boy that used to call me Pa, and of the woman who gave him that right." She didn't ask what happened, and he didn't say. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. Ruth reached out, took his calloused hand with her small one and held it, just for a moment. Then she pulled back and lay down again, curling against Caleb, her breaths ragged but slowing. Gideon sat there long after she drifted off, watching the fire, listening to the wind, and wondering if this strange, strong little girl had somehow managed to break into the last part of him still breathing. The next day dawned sharper, colder. Snow had stopped, but the air had gone brittle and thin, like a sheet of ice stretched over everything. The cabin walls creaked in protest with each gust of wind, and frost thickened along the window panes. Gideon Boone rose before light as he always did, rubbing stiffness from his shoulder before reaching for his coat and stepping outside. The forest had turned white overnight, quiet as a prayer. No birds called, no branches snapped. Even the mule Amos led past yesterday had left no prints now, erased like memories too old to matter. Gideon returned to the cabin with 2 full buckets of water balanced across his shoulders and a dead rabbit swinging from his belt. When he stepped inside, the warmth was startling. Ruth had fed the fire. The girl was up, fully dressed, hair braided tight down her back, stirring oats in the dented pot as if she'd done it every day for years. "You hunted?" she asked without turning. "Trapped," Gideon replied. She glanced at the rabbit hanging beside the door. "That'll last 2 days if we stretch it." Gideon grunted. "You always calculate like that." She finally turned to him, face unreadable. "Always." He studied her for a moment. She had her mother's weariness, no doubt, but also something older, something hardened not by age, but by grief that didn't let go. Gideon knew that look because he'd worn it himself for years. "Boy still asleep?" he asked. She nodded. "He had a good night." Did you? She hesitated, better than usual. That was all she offered, and all he asked. They ate quickly, Ruth feeding Caleb before herself. Gideon handed her a small piece of dried apple, his last. She broke it in half without pause and gave the bigger piece to Caleb. Gideon watched her carefully. You do that a lot. What? Give the bigger piece. She looked down. It's what Mama did. He nodded. What would she say about all this? About you climbing a mountain in winter? Ruth paused for a long beat. She'd say it wasn't smart. Then she'd ask if we were warm now, and if we said yes, she'd say then you did right. Gideon didn't smile, but he turned back to the stove with something close to approval in his eyes. By midday, the sky had clouded again, heavy with the promise of more snow. Ruth helped gather more wood, her fingers red and raw despite the gloves Gideon had found in a drawer. They were old and patched, but better than nothing. She worked without complaint, hauling kindling like a farmhand twice her age. You ever lived outside the hollow? Gideon asked, stacking logs. No. Then how'd you know how to find me? She hesitated. The preacher said the trail was old but marked. Mama's friend, Miss Harriet, she remembered the route from when she was a girl. She tell you what kind of man I was. She said you were quiet, kept to yourself. But she also said you once carried a boy 5 miles through the snow to the doctor when the creek froze over. Gideon stilled. She said your boy didn't make it, but you still carried him the whole way. The air around them seemed to crack then, not from cold but something deeper. Ruth didn't look at him, didn't apologize. She just kept stacking wood. You shouldn't have come here, he muttered after a long silence. Maybe not, she said, but we did. That night Caleb began coughing. It started small, a dry, papery sound, but by sundown it had grown into something deeper. Ruth sat up with him, holding his little frame against her chest, rocking gently beside the fire. Gideon watched from the table. He's sick often. Only when he's cold, she whispered. It started after Mama died. He stopped eating for a while, then the cough came. He have fever? A little. Gideon stepped away and returned with a cloth soaked in cold water. Ruth took it without asking. She pressed it to Caleb's head while murmuring soft, wordless sounds into his ear. We need honey, she said finally, or pine syrup, anything to ease the cough. Nearest supplies 3 miles down, Gideon said. Too far in this weather. Then we make do. Gideon knelt slowly, reaching for the small tin box beneath his bed. He opened it, revealing old salves, a jar of crushed herbs, and a vial of dark liquid wrapped in cloth. Juniper oil, he said. Mix it with heat. Won't cure him, but it'll ease the lungs. She took it, thank you. That night the cabin was restless. Caleb coughed through his dreams. Ruth stayed awake rubbing his back, and Gideon sat by the window, rifle across his knees. Not because he expected trouble, but because trouble didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it crept up slow, like a storm still hours away. The next morning brought tracks. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Gideon spotted them by the edge of the woods, half melted, pressed into the snow like warnings. He crouched beside them, measured the depth, the stride. One man, heavyset, came close, didn't approach the cabin, turned back. But why? When he returned, Ruth was cleaning the table, Caleb asleep on a bed of quilts. Someone was watching, Gideon said. Ruth didn't flinch. Do you think they'll come back? If they're smart, no. But if they're not, then I'll be ready. That afternoon, Ruth found the photograph. It was tucked in a drawer under folded linens, barely visible beneath a cracked Bible and a set of rusted nails. The frame was wood, carved by hand. The glass cracked, but the image was clear enough. A woman with bright eyes and soft curls, a boy maybe 5 or 6 standing beside her, and Gideon, younger, upright, almost smiling. She held it in her lap until Gideon came in, shaking snow from his coat. You still have this, she said. He froze. Why? Gideon crossed the room, took the frame gently from her hands, and stared at it for a long time. Because forgetting them didn't work, he said finally. She didn't say sorry, didn't offer platitudes. She just nodded, as if understanding something that didn't need to be said out loud. Night came with a strange calm. Caleb's cough had eased. Ruth finally slept soundly, her breathing deep and even. Gideon sat near the fire, the photo resting on the table beside him. Outside, the wind picked up again, and far down the mountain trail, a man lit a lantern and turned toward the cabin, a grin curling at his lips. The man with the lantern walked with purpose, slow and deliberate. He paused only once just past the fork where the trail split toward the ridge to study the outline of the mountain against the dusk. His breath misted in the bitter air, curling upward like smoke. In one hand he held the lantern. In the other, a rifle, worn and oiled and clearly used. His boots crunched down hard through the snow, obliterating any trace of earlier tracks. He didn't speak, he didn't whistle, but he knew exactly where he was going. Back at the cabin, Gideon felt it before he saw it. A tension in the wind, a wrongness in the stillness. He'd learned long ago to trust those feelings, the kind that weren't loud but gnawed at the edge of your ribs like a dull blade. He didn't move from the hearth just yet. He sat quiet in his chair, one ear turned to the silence outside, the other to the sound of Ruth humming softly as she rocked Caleb to sleep. "You ever hear wolves up here?" she asked quietly. "Sometimes." She paused. "You got traps set?" "I do." "Ever catch more than animals?" Gideon looked up slowly. Her eyes were on him, serious, unreadable, she knew. "I saw someone yesterday," she added, "just for a second in the trees." "You tell me this now." "I wasn't sure." He stood. "You're sure now?" "Yes." Gideon crossed to the window, drew the heavy curtain aside just an inch. Nothing but darkness stared back. Still, he moved with purpose, retrieving the second rifle from above the hearth and checking its chamber. "You think it's someone from Wren Hollow?" Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe." "You think it's about us?" "I don't know, but I've lived too long to believe in coincidence." He lit the lantern by the door but didn't hang it. Instead, he set it low on the floor, the flame muted under the glass. Shadows moved gently on the walls. Ruth pulled Caleb closer, shielding his small frame with her body. "You'll tell me if we need to run?" she asked. "No one's running tonight," Gideon said. Outside, the wind picked up. A tree branch cracked somewhere distant. But it wasn't that noise that made Gideon turn his head. It was the faint glint of movement, a flicker, a reflection. Lantern light. Too close. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle at his side but ready. The cold slapped him instantly, drawing tears to his eyes, but he didn't flinch. He peered into the woods. Then the voice came, smooth and easy. "Evening." Gideon didn't respond. A figure stepped into view. Tall, lean face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The lantern in his hand gave his features a golden glow, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You Gideon Boone?" "I am." "Then I reckon we got some things to talk about." Gideon studied the man. "You with the law?" The man chuckled. "No, sir, just a man with a need, and I think you might have what I'm after." "Not in the habit of trading with strangers after dark." The man raised the lantern higher. "Name S. Carson Drew, from down near Dry Ridge. I ain't armed." Gideon's eyes flicked to the rifle slung over the man's back. "That's so." Carson smiled wider. "You're right, I am armed, but I didn't come to draw, came to ask." "Ask what?" The man stepped forward one pace, not close enough to threaten, but close enough to show he wasn't scared. "You seen a girl?" he asked. 13 or so, brown hair, traveling with a boy about 3, same eyes. Gideon didn't blink. "Why?" Carson shrugged. "Let's just say she ran off with something that don't belong to her." "What'd she take?" "My boy," he said flatly. Gideon's hand gripped the rifle tighter. "She say anything about her past?" Carson asked. Gideon didn't answer. "About her daddy," Carson went on. "About how he used to drink a little too much. About how he made do after her mama passed. You see, I raised that girl, my blood. Didn't treat her like a princess, sure, but I fed her, gave her a roof." "She said he didn't come back from the trail," Gideon said, voice low. Carson's grin twisted. "That what she said?" Gideon didn't move. "Boy's name is Caleb." "Yeah, and he's mine." The words hung there, sharp and cold. She say different, Carson asked. She didn't say much at all. Carson's smile disappeared. I'm talking M back. No, Gideon said. The man blinked. What? I said no. You want the boy, come with papers. You want the girl, she'll choose. She's a child, Carson growled. Not anymore. They stared at each other for a long time, the fire between them flickering through the windows, casting both men as ghosts. You just bought yourself trouble, Boone. Gideon didn't flinch. I've lived through worse. Carson didn't argue. He just turned, walked back into the trees, and vanished without another word. Inside the cabin, Ruth stood with Caleb in her arms, her back pressed against the wall, eyes wide and full of knowing. You heard? Gideon asked. She nodded. Is it true? She looked down at Caleb's sleeping face, then back at Gideon. He ain't my blood, but I raised him. Mama had him with someone else. Before she died, she made me promise. Promise what? To keep him safe, no matter what. Gideon stared at her hard. And Carson? He beat Mama, he beat me. Said he'd sell Caleb to the banker's wife for a debt. That's why we ran. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have opened the door if I had? He didn't answer. Ruth stepped forward. You think I'd lie about something like that? No, he said finally, I don't. She nodded once. Then I guess you've got trouble. I've had it before. But this time, you got us too. The next morning, Gideon packed supplies. Dried meat, flint, spare cartridges. He didn't speak much, but Ruth knew enough not to ask. Are we leaving? She asked finally. No. Then why? We prepare. For what? For when he comes back. She paused. You think he will? I know his type. He didn't come up here to ask, he came to take. And if he brings more men, then I'll fight. You think you can win? No, but I can make them lose too. Ruth set her jaw. What can I do? Keep the fire going, keep Caleb calm, and don't open that door unless it's me. She nodded. I can shoot too. You ever held a rifle? No, but I've held worse. Gideon almost smiled at that. We'll start today. That afternoon he taught her to load, aim, and brace. Her hands were too small for the kick, but she learned fast. She didn't flinch, didn't complain. You listen good, he said after her third shot. I watch better, she replied. Later, when Caleb was napping and Ruth was tending the stew, Gideon stood at the edge of the porch staring down the trail. Wind picked up again, cold bit deep, but in his chest something had thawed. A little boy, a brave girl, a promise not made but forming. They weren't his. Not yet. But he'd fight like they were. The storm rolled in before nightfall. No thunder, no lightning, just a wall of white sweeping in from the eastern ridgeline, swallowing trees, blurring distance, turning the entire world into a cold whisper. By dusk, snow came sideways, flung by wind so sharp it whistled through the gaps in the cabin walls. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, but its warmth felt fragile, like a single candle in a cathedral of ice. Gideon double-barricaded the door. Not just the bolt, but the iron rod across the frame, the old wooden beam he hadn't used in years. He moved through the room with silent urgency, checking the shutters, laying out ammunition, cleaning his rifle with steady hands. Ruth watched him without speaking, sitting cross-legged beside Caleb, her little brother curled into her side beneath a quilt that smelled of pine and smoke. You think he's coming tonight? She asked finally, voice low. Yes. You think he'll wait for daylight? No. She swallowed. Should we hide? No point. This cabin's got 2 rooms, he knows that. He's not gonna knock again. Ruth's eyes fell to the pistol on the table. You think he'll shoot? I think he'll do worse than that. Gideon didn't say it for effect. He didn't believe in scaring children, but Ruth wasn't a child in the way most folks meant. She de-raised a boy through hunger and cold. She de-walked 3 valleys with that boy on her back. She de-lied to a preacher, tracked down a mountain man, and knocked on the one door she knew might open. She de-earned the right to truth. I can take Caleb into the crawl space, she offered. Gideon shook his head. If they breach the door, they'll search everything. If you hide, it has to be out there. He pointed to the trapdoor in the floorboards, barely visible beneath the old rug. Ruth's eyes followed his hand. That root cellar goes back further than it should. Dug it deep years ago when things were worse. You'll be safe there if it comes to that. If it comes to that, she repeated. Gideon turned to her. You know what to do. Ruth nodded. Keep him quiet. Wait for your voice. Don't open the door for anything else. He handed her the pistol. Loaded, but only fire if they see you. She gripped the weapon without flinching. I understand. Gideon stared at her. I don't know who taught you to be this brave. My mother, she said, and grief. The hours passed slow, too slow. Caleb fell asleep again, exhausted by the stale air and low fever still lingering in his chest. Ruth paced like a cat, small steps, soft boots, her shadow flickering across the logs. Gideon sat by the window, eyes locked on the dark beyond the glass. Snow swirled like ghosts in the lantern light. Then came the sound. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not one set, two, maybe three, crunching, slow, deliberate. They were smart enough not to shout, not to call out like drunks or bandits. These men knew how to hunt, and they were hunting tonight. Gideon didn't move. He didn't blink. His hand rested on the rifle, finger just outside the trigger guard. He whispered, now. Ruth nodded once and scooped Caleb into her arms. He stirred but didn't wake. She crossed the cabin in 4 careful steps, lifted the rug, opened the trapdoor and vanished beneath it. Gideon followed, laid the rug back down and took his place behind the table. The fire burned low now, casting long shadows. He kept it that way. They'd expect warmth, light. He wanted them guessing. Minutes passed, then came a knock. Not weak, not soft. 3 hard raps, the sound of certainty. Gideon stood slowly, stepped toward the door. Who's there? A familiar voice. Carson Drew, we met already. I remember. Thought I'd give you another chance, to do the right thing. What's that? Return what don't belong to you. Gideon chuckled, the sound dry. You don't get to use that word, you ain't earned it. Silence. Then, last warning, Boone. Gideon said nothing. I brought men this time, ain't just me. Gideon looked to the window, saw shadows moving just past the trees, at least 2 others, maybe more. I'm giving you a chance to walk away, Carson called again, but I ain't waiting long. Still Gideon said nothing. Carson's voice dropped lower. You don't want a war, old man, you can't win it. I don't need to win, Gideon replied finally, loud enough to be heard. I just need to make sure you lose. Silence followed, then a curse, then the unmistakable scuff of boots in snow, rapid steps approaching fast. The door shook once, then twice. Gideon backed up and aimed. When the door burst open, he fired. The first man through the threshold dropped like stone, a cry torn from his throat before he crumpled at Gideon's feet. The second ducked behind the frame, firing wild. A shot cracked past Gideon's head, grazing the mantel. Wood splintered. Gideon moved fast, low, rolled behind the table, fired again, this time through the wall. A yelp followed. Movement scrambled outside. Then another shot, this one from behind the cabin. Glass shattered as a bullet tore through the rear window, striking low. Caleb's quilt pile exploded in fluff. Empty. Good, they were hidden. Gideon reloaded quickly, heart steady. He'd fought worse odds. He turned just in time to see Carson push through the door, rifle raised. Boone! Gideon fired again. The bullet struck the doorframe inches from Carson's head. He ducked, fired back, but the shot went wide. Smoke filled the cabin. The fire roared in the sudden draft. Then came silence. Long dead. Gideon stood slowly, ears ringing. Ruth, he called softly. No answer. He moved to the rug, lifted it, opened the trapdoor. She stared back at him, eyes wide but calm, pistol ready. It's done, he said. She climbed out slowly, Caleb cradled against her chest. He was awake now, quiet but alert. Did you kill them? She asked. I think one's still breathing. What now? Now I decide what mercy looks like. By dawn the storm had eased. The cabin was full of smoke, snow piling through the shattered window, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. Gideon dragged 2 bodies to the edge of the woods. Carson wasn't among them. He'd fled into the night, wounded but not dead. Ruth sat at the hearth, rubbing Caleb's back while the stew boiled again. "Will he come back?" she asked. "Maybe. And next time." Gideon stared at the rifle, then at the photograph on the table. "Next time I don't wait." That night Ruth spoke while Caleb slept. "You didn't have to protect us." Gideon didn't respond. "But you did." Still, he said nothing. "I think Mama would have liked you." He looked over. "Why is that?" "Because you say less than she did, but you mean more." He almost smiled. "I'm no one's father." "Maybe not," she whispered, "but you're something, and you saved us." He didn't reply. But he sat beside her, close enough for warmth. And that for now was enough. By the time the bodies were buried and the broken door replaced with one Gideon fashioned from timber hewn just below the ridge, the snow had begun to melt in patches. The thaw came slow, shy, as if afraid the cold might return and punish it for hope. Ice clung stubbornly to the north-facing trees, but the sun finally lingered long enough to soften the world's edges. Inside the cabin the mood had shifted. Not lighter, not exactly. Ruth didn't laugh more, and Caleb still woke with cries some nights, but there was something new threading itself into the quiet. Stability. A rhythm. The kind of thing that can only grow where terror no longer lives. Gideon rose early each morning to check the trap lines and haul water from the creek. Ruth took over the cooking completely, her hands always in motion, always measuring, always stretching rations with a cleverness well beyond her years. Caleb toddled after Gideon now, less afraid, more curious, his cough nearly gone. There were no more knocks at the door. But the memory of that night hadn't left them. One morning, Ruth found Gideon standing at the edge of the clearing, staring down the trail where Carson had vanished. She walked up quietly beside him. "You think he died out there?" Gideon didn't look at her. "No." "You think he'll come back?" "I don't know." She crossed her arms against the wind. "I wish I did." "He's not the only kind of danger out here," Gideon said, voice low. "But he's the one that knows your face. That makes him different." Ruth nodded. "What would you do if he came back?" she asked. "Same as before." She paused. "What if I wasn't here?" Gideon turned then, looked at her, really looked. "You planning to leave?" "I don't know," she whispered. "I think about it sometimes." He nodded slow. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. "Because maybe you didn't ask for this." "I didn't," he said simply. She blinked. That wasn't the answer she expected. "But that doesn't mean I don't want it," he added. Her mouth fell open just slightly. "You mean, us?" He didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't change expression at all. He just looked at her, and it was the first time Ruth truly believed she'd found something that couldn't be taken away. "I'm not your father," he said. "I know. But I'm not nothing either." "I know that too." And that was that. Spring crept up slow, like a fawn stepping from under a pine branch. A few green shoots poked up near the south wall of the cabin. Ruth planted some onion bulbs and potatoes Gideon had stored in sacks, their eyes already sprouting. She dug the earth with her hands, thick and cold, her fingernails blackened with dirt. Caleb helped by dropping rocks into a pail and forgetting where he'd put them. At night they sat around the fire, and sometimes Ruth would tell stories. Most were things she half remembered from her mother, tales of clever animals, or the time her mother saw a preacher faint when a bird flew into his sermon. Other times, she told real stories. About how she carried Caleb on her back when his shoes gave out. About the time she found a half-eaten apple and fed him the good side. About the quiet man on the mountain who gave them a home when they had none left. Gideon listened without speaking, but every time she finished a story she noticed he'd whittled something else. A little bird, a horse, once a tree stump with tiny eyes carved beneath it. "You're good at that," she said once, holding up one of his carvings. He shrugged. "Hands need something to do." "Did you carve things before?" "I used to make toys for." He trailed off. Ruth didn't ask. She just nodded and placed the carving gently on the shelf beside the others. Then came the writer. It was late afternoon when they heard the hoofbeats, clear this time, not creeping, not stealthy. A single horse, slow gait, confident. Gideon stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but lowered. Ruth stood just inside the doorway, holding Caleb. The man was older, stocky, wearing a weathered blue coat and hat. His horse was lean, ribs visible, hooves caked with miles of dust. The man stopped 20 yards from the cabin, raised a hand in greeting. "You Gideon Boone?" "I am." The man nodded. "Name S. Curtis Hale, sheriff from down near Nettle Creek." Gideon said nothing. "I ain't here for trouble," Curtis continued. "But I got a notice on a man named Carson Drew. Thought you might have seen him." Ruth stepped out fully now. "He was here." The sheriff's eyes shifted to her. "That's so. He tried to take me and my brother." Gideon spoke then. He claimed the boy was his, claimed the girl ran off with him. Curtis sighed. "That sounds like Carson." "He's still wanted by law?" Gideon asked. "Worse, he's been using the boy to con money out of grieving families, selling false adoptions. Got 4 towns looking for him now. He said Caleb was his." Curtis shook his head. "Carson never had kids, ain't capable of caring for a dog, much less a child. Any blood claim he made was fiction." Gideon glanced at Ruth, then back at the sheriff. "He fled north, into the timberline, wounded." Curtis nodded. "Reckon I'll find him, sooner or later." He looked at Ruth again. "You all right, miss?" "I am now." Curtis tipped his hat. "That boy yours?" She looked down at Caleb, who blinked up at the stranger and then tucked his head against her neck. "Yes," she said, "he is." "Then I'll say no more." He turned his horse gently, started down the trail again. Before he vanished into the trees, Gideon called out, "If you find him." Curtis paused. "Don't bring him back here." The sheriff nodded once. "I won't." After Curtis left, something in the air felt different, final, as if the world had taken a breath and for the first time didn't exhale fear. That night Ruth made cornbread with the last of the flour. Caleb clapped when she pulled it from the pan. Gideon chuckled low, shook his head and said, "You're spoiling him." Ruth shrugged. "Maybe it's his turn." Gideon sat across from her, elbows on the table. "You ever think about what comes next?" She thought for a moment. "Not until now." "Well, I don't know," she said. "I've never stayed in one place long enough to think about that." "You could. You want us to?" He met her eyes. "I'd like you to." Ruth didn't answer. She looked down at Caleb, who was now asleep again in her lap, his mouth full of crumbs, his face peaceful. "We don't have anything to give you," she whispered. "You gave me purpose." Her eyes welled, but she blinked it away. "You sure?" "I'm sure." She reached across the table, took his hand. "I think we're already yours." Outside, the wind changed direction. It was warm now, carried the scent of thawing bark and wet earth. The storm had broken. Inside, for the first time in years, Gideon Boone smiled and meant it. The weeks that followed moved with a gentler rhythm. Spring settled in slow and sure, dripping off the eaves, soaking the dirt road until it turned to soft mud beneath their boots. Trees budded along the ridge. The river at the base of the trail, once choked with ice, now ran thick and fast, fed by meltwater and sun. The cabin began to change too, not in structure but in spirit. Ruth scrubbed the floors till they lost their gray pallor. She stitched curtains from a torn sackcloth Gideon had buried in the storage chest. Caleb collected rocks and lined them along the windowsill. Gideon, for his part, didn't say much about the changes, but he didn't stop them either. One morning, Ruth caught him staring at the table where her new curtains fluttered in the draft. His gaze was unreadable, but something about it felt like approval. The kind a man gives when he sees life slowly pushing up through places he thought long dead. Caleb now called Gideon Pa. It started as a slip, a sleepy mumble as he climbed into Gideon's lap after a long day hauling firewood. Gideon froze at first. The boy had never said it before, not even once. Ruth tensed too, watching from across the room. But Gideon didn't correct him. He simply said, "That's all right, son," and wrapped his arm around the boy's back. Ruth turned away quickly then, blinking hard, but not fast enough to keep one tear from trailing down her cheek. Trouble, when it finally returned, did not come with guns. It came with paper. 3 men rode up the trail just before midday. They wore no badges, carried no rifles, and called out before crossing the tree line. Their boots were polished, their coats heavy with waxed canvas. One carried a leather satchel stamped with the seal of a county Ruth had never heard of. Gideon stepped outside before they could reach the porch, rifle not in hand, but close. "Morning," the tallest man said, tipping his hat. "We're looking for a Ruth Wren." Ruth appeared in the doorway, Caleb's small hand clasped tightly in hers. "That's me." The man nodded, glancing down at the satchel. "Name's Richard Alcott. I work for the Orphan Commission out of Baton Creek." Ruth stiffened. "We're not orphans." "Legally, you are," he replied gently. "Your mother's death was registered, your father declared deceased after desertion. Your name was filed with the commission 6 months ago." "I didn't file anything." "No," Alcott said, "but a traveling preacher did. Claimed you and your brother were in danger. He said he couldn't keep you but hoped someone would. The paperwork took time to reach us." Gideon stepped forward. "Why are you here now?" Alcott nodded to the 2 men behind him. "We're here to confirm the safety of the child and determine the suitability of the guardian." "I am the guardian," Ruth said. "You're 13, Alcott said softly. "I've raised him since birth." "I don't doubt that," he replied, "but the law—" "Law didn't come looking for us when we were starving in a barn in Bitter Hollow," Ruth cut in. "Law didn't carry my brother through snow. Law didn't cover him in the middle of the night when his lungs wheezed so loud I thought he'd stop breathing." Alcott removed his hat, his face somber. "You're right." "Then why are you here?" He took a slow breath. "Because someone down the mountain filed a counterclaim." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Carson Drew." Alcott nodded. "He's in custody now. Caught him trying to pass the boy off again in Miller's Bend. The sheriff from Nettle Creek confirmed your story, but Carson had documentation, fake maybe, but it's forcing our office to reevaluate custody." Ruth's voice was steel. "You're not taking him." Alcott held up both hands. "I don't want to, I just need to ask questions, talk to the boy, talk to you." "You can talk to us right here." He hesitated, then gestured to the porch. "May we sit?" Gideon nodded once and pulled out the chairs. They spoke for over an hour. Ruth told the whole truth. Not just about Carson, but about the long months on the trail, the men who tried to barter Caleb like he was cattle, the outposts that turned her away, the day she knocked on Gideon's door and prayed someone would answer. Gideon said little, but when he did speak, he spoke clearly about what he saw in Ruth that day, about the way she watched over her brother, the way she never asked for more than what she needed, the way she never lied, even when it would have been easier. Caleb sat on Gideon's lap the whole time, silent but alert, his small hands wrapped around Gideon's thumb. When the questioning ended, Alcott stood and removed a single document from his satchel. "This is a temporary guardianship form. It names Mr. Boone as caretaker for both of you until a court hearing can be held." Ruth's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Alcott said, "you stay here, he stays with you. But in a month's time we'll need to travel to Baton Creek to make it permanent." Ruth looked to Gideon. "Is that what you want?" Gideon met her gaze. "Only if it's what you want too." She looked down at Caleb, who nodded sleepily. "Yes," she whispered. Alcott smiled. "Then sign here." They did. After the men left, Ruth stood alone on the porch. The sun had begun its slow dip toward the ridge, casting long shadows across the dirt yard. Gideon joined her a few minutes later, brushing sawdust from his hands. "You all right?" "I think so," she said. "I didn't know it would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like we belong to someone." Gideon looked down at her. "I never told you about my boy." She waited. "He was 5 when the sickness came. Took him fast. One day he was running through the snow with a stick pretending it was a sword. Next day he couldn't lift his head." Ruth stared at the trees, her voice low. "And your wife?" "Didn't survive the grief. She went quiet. One day she just walked into the woods and didn't come back." Ruth said nothing. "I built this cabin after, came up the mountain and never looked down again." "But you did," she whispered. He nodded. "You made me." Ruth reached up and took his hand. "I'm glad." He gripped her fingers gently. "So am I." That night, Caleb drew with charcoal on the edge of firewood while Ruth braided her hair. Gideon carved a little bird and placed it on the shelf beside the others. He carved 2 lines into the edge of the fireplace stone, one for each life that had walked into his home and stayed. The cabin, once a place of ghosts, now echoed with the quiet sound of family. Not loud, not full of laughter, but rooted, real. Spring gave way to summer, and with it, the forest shed its gray. Trees, once skeletal, now stood in proud bloom, their canopies thick with green and the occasional flutter of songbirds nesting deep within their branches. The river no longer roared with the fury of thaw. It meandered now, slow and warm, brushing lazily against the rocks where Caleb liked to splash. Ruth had taught him to find minnows with his bare hands, giggling softly whenever he managed to catch one. Sometimes she laughed too. Not often. But it was happening more. The garden behind the cabin had taken root. Gideon had extended it, adding 2 raised beds and a fence to keep the rabbits out. Ruth planted more onions, beets, and a few stunted tomato vines from a traveling peddler's pouch of seeds. Every morning she tended it barefoot, her skirt tied at the waist, her sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged on her cheek. It was the first time Gideon had seen her as more than a child carrying burdens no child should. She still carried them, but now she did it with purpose, not survival. They were building something, not just routines, not just shelter, but a life. It was late June when the letter arrived. A rider, young and red-faced from the climb, handed it to Gideon on the trail. The envelope bore the stamp of the Baton Creek Orphan Commission. Gideon didn't open it right away. He tucked it into his coat pocket and returned to the cabin, his pace slower than usual. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep and Ruth sat darning socks by the hearth, Gideon finally unsealed the envelope. He read the letter twice, then handed it to her without a word. She took it with careful fingers. Her eyes scanned the page. To Ruth Wren and Mr. Gideon Boone. The Orphan Commission of Baton Creek is pleased to inform you that, based on testimony, circumstance, and the absence of any legal challenges, full guardianship has been granted to Mr. Boone, with Ruth Wren designated as co-guardian to Caleb Wren. You are no longer required to appear in person. Your case is considered closed and in good standing. Congratulations. There was no signature beyond a printed name, but it didn't need one. Ruth looked up, stunned. "It's done," she whispered. "It's done," Gideon said. A strange stillness filled the cabin then, not silence but awe, like when a storm has passed and you realize the roof held, that the walls stood, that you're still breathing. Ruth folded the letter slowly. Her eyes glistened. "I never thought," she began, but the words faltered. "We were always moving, always hiding, and now—" "You're not hiding anymore," Gideon said. She nodded slowly. "And you're not alone." He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand, squeezed it gently. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "What now?" "Now," he said, "we live." And they did. The days lengthened and the air warmed. Caleb grew bolder, chasing chickens, building forts with fallen branches, and climbing onto Gideon's lap whenever the old man carved. Ruth began teaching him his letters, scratching them into the dirt with a stick, guiding his hand gently as he learned to shape his name. One evening, Ruth sat on the porch steps while Gideon patched a hinge on the barn. She watched the sun melt across the ridge, painting the trees gold. "I want to build something," she said suddenly. Gideon looked over. "Not a fence, not a chair, something that outlasts us." "You have any idea what?" "I want to teach other girls like me, ones who were left behind, ones who had to grow up too fast." He leaned against the barn post. "You think they'd come up a mountain for that?" "I think if I went down and told them what waited here, they might." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll make room." She smiled, slow and sure. "I already have." By the end of summer, the cabin had changed again. Gideon built another room, not big, but enough. Ruth painted the walls with wildflowers, simple outlines with charcoal, filled in with crushed berry pigment. It wasn't fancy, but it was beautiful in the way only homemade things are. Curtis Hale, the sheriff, returned once more with supplies and papers. He watched Caleb sprint through the yard chasing a chicken, then looked at Gideon. "He's different." "They both are," Gideon said. Curtis handed him a piece of paper. "This makes it official." Gideon looked down. It was a land deed, his cabin and the surrounding 6 acres, now registered under his and Ruth's names jointly. Curtis shrugged. "A thank you from the folks in Baton Creek. Seems your name's been making its way around." Gideon didn't smile, but his hand didn't tremble as he took the deed. Later, he placed it in the same drawer where the old photograph still lived. He didn't bury the past, but he'd made peace with it. One evening, Caleb brought a bundle of twigs and laid them on the porch. "I'm building a fort," he said proudly. Ruth knelt beside him. "A fort?" "Uh-huh, for me and Pa so we can fight the bad guys if they come back." She ruffled his hair. "They won't come back, baby. But if they do, we'll be ready, right?" She looked to Gideon, who leaned in the doorway watching them. "Yeah," she said, "we'll be ready." Time passed. The seasons turned again. And the cabin on the mountain became more than a home. It became a place of stories, of rebirth, of second chances. A place where a man who had lost everything learned to open his door again. A place where a girl who had nothing found a father. And a little boy, barely more than a shadow once, now ran laughing through sunlit fields, knowing, without question, that he was loved. The first frost of the new year came without warning, curling its icy fingers around the eaves of the cabin, biting into the garden beds that Ruth had covered in burlap the night before. The mountain had gone quiet again, not like winter-dead quiet, but the kind that came with waiting, stillness that wasn't empty, only listening. Gideon felt it in his bones, the same way he once felt storms before they arrived. Only this wasn't weather. It was something else. The boy was growing. Caleb no longer clung to Ruth's skirts or buried himself in Gideon's lap after every thunderclap. He ran now, up the trail, around the coop, down by the creek. He asked questions about everything. Why snow melted faster near the tree trunks. Why birds disappeared when the wind blew from the east. Why some men hurt people they claimed to love. That last question had come out of nowhere. They'd been fishing. Caleb had pulled a small trout from the water and looked up with that wide-eyed seriousness only children possess. Gideon hadn't answered right away. He never did. But the question hung there long after the fish was cleaned and tossed into the skillet. Millie's letter was short. "I've heard you made it. I want to learn how. Can I come?" Ruth read it twice, then handed it to Gideon without speaking. "She won't be the last," he said after a long silence. "I know. You ready for that?" Ruth looked out the window. Caleb was trying to stack firewood like Gideon, the small pieces falling sideways in a crooked pile. "I think I was made for it." They cleared space in the root cellar, turned the old pantry into a second bedroom. Gideon repaired the broken bunk bed frame he'd once used for his son. It creaked now, but held strong. When Millie arrived, she was thinner than Ruth remembered. Her eyes sunken, her voice raspy, but she was alive. She carried nothing but a canvas bag and a pair of shoes too small for her feet. The first thing she did when she stepped inside was collapse into Ruth's arms. The second thing she did was cry. Not loud, not long, just enough. Ruth held her there beside the hearth, Caleb watching with wide eyes, Gideon standing near the window, his hand resting gently on the rifle that hadn't been used in months. That night Millie slept soundly for the first time in years. And when she woke, she asked if she could stay. Spring came again. The thaw softened the earth early that year, as if the mountain itself was loosening its grip on the past. Birds returned to the canopy, loud and reckless. Rabbits scurried through the brush with the arrogance of creatures who believed they'd seen the last of frost. By then 3 more girls had arrived. They came one by one, some by wagon, some on foot, none with fathers, all carrying stories too big for their shoulders. And Ruth welcomed them. She gave them chores, yes, but also books, structure, bread fresh from the fire, nights around the table where no one interrupted and everyone was heard. The cabin, once silent, now buzzed with quiet chaos, socks drying on windowsills, laughter over split porridge, voices raised not in fear but in song. Gideon built a second outhouse. Then a third. One evening, Ruth found him standing on the porch long after sundown, his face lit only by the glow from inside. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded slowly, just remembering how quiet it used to be. "You miss it?" He didn't answer at first, then sometimes, but not for long. She leaned against the rail beside him. "I used to think I'd always be running." "You're still moving, you just chose the direction." She smiled. "You think we'll keep getting girls?" "Yes." "You think we can handle it?" "We already are." In time, they started calling it the Wren House. The name wasn't formal. There was no sign, but people began to speak of it that way. Up in the hills, they'd say, "There's a house where girls go when there's nowhere else. Where they're not taken in but chosen. Where they're not given pity but purpose. Where a girl named Ruth and a mountain man named Gideon turned one desperate knock into a door that never closed again." Years passed. Caleb grew tall. His laugh came easy. His hands grew strong from splitting wood beside Gideon and steady from writing letters at the kitchen table. Ruth taught him how to read the Bible and how to mend a wound. Gideon taught him to shoot straight, speak less, and mean more. On his 10th birthday, Caleb carved a bird from soft pine. He gave it to Gideon and said only, "You taught me." Gideon kept it on the mantel, right beside the first one he ever made. And so it was. A cabin in the mountains became more than a home. It became a place of beginning. Not again, but for the first time. A boy found his voice. A girl became a mother. And a man who had once turned his back on the world found that love, quiet, steady, undeserved, had been waiting all along. Not with fanfare. Not with grand declarations. But with a knock. 3 times. Just enough.